Hi, this is Scott Wilkinson, host of Home Theater Geeks. In episode 157, I chat with recording engineer Bill Schnee about his quest to bring high-resolution audio to the masses. So stay tuned.
Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit.
Bandwidth for Home Theater Geeks is provided by CacheFly at CACHEFLY.com.
This is Home Theater Geeks with Scott Wilkinson, recorded April 29th, 2013. Episode 157, The New Fidelity. This episode of Home Theater Geeks is brought to you by Hulu Plus. Watch as many TV shows as you want, anytime, anywhere, on any device, all streamed instantly to you. Visit huluplus.com/twit to start your free 2-week trial. That's huluplus.com/twit. Or go to twit.tv and click the Hulu Plus banner. Hey there, Scott Wilkinson here, the Home Theater Geek. This week's guest geek is recording engineer Bill Schnee, whose new record label, Bravura Records, is working on some really interesting high-end, high-resolution audio projects for the masses. Hey, Bill, welcome to the show.
Welcome. Thank you. Good to be here.
So glad you're here. Yeah. Now, those of you who are watching live at live.twit.tv or logged into the chat room at irc.twit.tv can post questions for Bill as we go along, and I'll pass along as many as I can. So, Bill, I can't help but notice that behind you are a bunch of gold and what I can only assume are platinum records. Those are all your work?
Yeah, that's a piece of it, yes.
Incredible. Tell us a little bit about how you got into this business, who some of those records represent. What have you done in your career?
I started in, like a lot of guys, behind the glass, on the other side of the glass, as a musician in a band. And we got signed right out of high school and worked with a producer at a couple of the top studios in town. And then when our singles failed, we got another record deal with another company. And our producer there was an engineer as well. And when I remember this very defining moment when I went in for the first playback of our first track, that I heard sound coming out of the speakers that I had never heard in the great studios that we had already worked in. And I asked him right then if he could teach me how to do that, and he respectfully declined, and we went on working on our record. But that was the defining moment. I then went and found a way to a small studio where I lived still with my parents while I was in college, and got started that way.
So you learned the ropes, you learned how to be an engineer in that way after having been on the other side of the glass. What really attracted you was being in the control room, right?
The sound that captivated me, and I wanted to know how to do that. I wanted to be able to control that. At the time when I started doing that, it really was just as I thought as an adjunct for my band, or an adjunct at the most for producing. And indeed, that's what it has turned out to be. And I've had a very, very, very colorful and very blessed career. Been very fortunate.
And so who are some of the groups you've worked with? Who are some of the people represented by those gold records behind you?
I should have told you not to ask me that question, or if you were going to ask me that, for me to make a list, because I'm terrible at this. But let me try.
Well, I know, for example, you worked on a couple of Steely Dan records.
Yes. Good sound has always been important to me. So I obviously from the outset. So I worked really hard about honing that aspect of it. I've been personally nominated 11 times for Best Engineered Grammy, and I've won twice, both for Steely Dan. That makes me a 9-time loser, by the way. And if you ask my kids, it's a higher number. But apart from that, let's see, I started. The first thing I would have done that was successful was I worked on a Three Dog Night album, and from there, I mean, where do I go? Carly Simon, Steely Dan, Neil Diamond, Barbra Streisand, a lot of work with her. Dire Straits, Mark Knopfler, Whitney Houston, good amount of work with her.
So you've clearly worked with with many of the greats in the music industry. And I'm particularly interested in Steely Dan, A, because I'm a big fan, but B, and perhaps more important to this discussion, they were always very, very careful about the sound quality of their records. They have Donald Fagen in particular, and I guess Walter Becker to some degree, has a reputation for being a perfectionist and needing everything to be just exactly right. And you shared that passion, I assume?
Yes. Well, I started with them doing the tracks for Asia. Excuse me, the album Asia, and the interesting thing is they left me alone, tremendously left me alone, and the tracking went very, very quickly. They had always planned on going off and doing the overdubs for months and months and months, and in fact asked me if I would mix it when they were done. But I knew from watching them how they worked with the tracking process that it would probably never work. But we did go in after 6 months. I think they had their first song done or almost done. And we went in and tried to mix it together. And at the end of the day, I said, thank you very much. And we parted ways on that album. Just a very different, at that time, there was no computer mixing. And I've always been about mixing as a performance. So whereas they were much more interested in getting absolute perfection. And those two don't have very big concentric circles. Just a different style is all. And obviously I love their records and I love them. Donald is an incredible talent.
Boy, that's for sure. I couldn't agree more with that. Now, at some point in your career, you went over to, I guess you'd call it a label called Sheffield Labs.
Right. There was a label that started by Doug Sachs and Lincoln Mayorga that owned the Mastering Lab, which was and continues to be one of the top mastering studios in California. And they started a little label called Sheffield, which really was just to record Lincoln. Lincoln is an extremely accomplished pianist, classical and otherwise. And their first one was, I think, 69. The second record they made was in 71. In 73, they asked me to engineer it, the third album that they made of Lincoln's. And after doing that album, which was live direct to disc, that means that we recorded all 5 songs in a row without stopping, because it goes right to the lathe, which is a mechanical process. So there was no stopping the lathe, and it requires a lot of concentration, and there's a great amount of pressure. And
so in other words, the entire performance of some number of songs, 5 songs, you said, 5 tracks, all had to be performed as in a live performance with no breaks, no cuts, no let's try that again, just beginning to end, one take, that's it.
That's it. That's it, all in one fell swoop. And I found that process to be the most exciting and challenging thing I had done in my very young career. By then I was professional for maybe 4 years. And I was extremely excited by it. So I asked, after the completion of the album, I asked Doug Sachs if I could produce an album for them, and I wanted to use a vocalist. And Lincoln had a lot of hesitation because the label was, he thought they had started it just for his own recordings, and now they were going to turn the money over to a young kid to do something that had never been done before. And so there was a lot of good reason for his hesitation, but Doug talked him into it. Excuse me. And I had only worked with 2 people that I knew could go in and give a performance every time. The first one was Barbara Streisand, and I went to her manager at the time, and he basically said, "Go away, kid." And then Thelma Houston, who I had worked with, who was an artist on Motown, and she loved the idea, and Motown let us have her, and we did this album with her, which was a groundbreaking album because that really set the stage. I believe it still is the biggest selling directed disc record that was ever done, that first one. And it was where all of my abilities come together as a producer and engineer, is doing something like that, the live recording. And of course, there is where you can't expect perfection. Having said that, when you put phenomenal musicians and singers in a room together, just like any live performance in a show, synergy of what's there can give true magic, which unfortunately, the way we've been making, all of us have been making records for the most part for 40 some years, it doesn't preclude that, but we all take advantage of the ability to perfect things. Mm-hmm. And that perfection, albeit there, can sometimes have a cost. And so it doesn't preclude the idea of having a real performance, but live recording guarantees a live performance.
Sure. Before we get deeper into that, and we certainly will, Titus in the chat room is asking me to ask you about Huey Lewis. The album was recorded within 3 weeks, and the producer was Bill Schnee, who had produced for Boss Skaggs and Pablo Cruz. Any interesting stories from the Huey Lewis project?
There's a... If he wants to send me an email at info@Bravura, it's a long-winded. There's definitely some interesting stories there, but maybe not for here.
Not for this show. Okay, well,
not for this show.
Your email is info@bravurarecords.com. Is that right?
Yeah, that'd be the best one.
Okay, we'll certainly let people know about your website as well, which is very interesting to talk about. In terms of what we want to talk about today, which is the evolution from the Sheffield Labs days when you were recording direct to disc, in that case analog. As you said earlier, everything was analog in those days. There wasn't anything digital. So you had to take whatever microphone feeds you had coming in. And I wanted to ask you about this with regard to the piano player in particular, how many mics you used and so on. But then you had to mix that in real time while he's playing, and then that goes directly to a lathe, which is cutting an LP directly from the signal, the live signal that's coming in.
Correct.
So quickly, let me ask you, how many channels do you have to mix in that kind of situation? With a piano, for example, I wouldn't think it'd be that many. With a whole group, it'd be a lot more.
No, it was not a solo piano record. He was the pianist on the first record, but we had we had a horn section and percussion and bass and drums, and it was a full studio of musicians, as was Thelma. Thelma was even more. We had the console in the studio that we were forced to work at because it was the studio that was right behind the mastering lab where the lathe was, or lathes were.
Right.
By Thelma, we had two. So that console only had 32 inputs, and we had more mics than that, so much so that we had, between cuts, it was a little bit longer gap between songs than normal. Instead of the 2 to 3 seconds, it's more like 5 or 6. But in that gap of 5 to 6 seconds, I had an assistant out in the studio who would change inputs on the piano, because we had on Thelma, we had a tack piano, electric piano, and an acoustic piano. So certain concessions had to be made to get the job done.
But there you are mixing on a console up to 32 channels of audio down to 2. And, keeping with the pans where they're supposed to be, that is how far to the right or left an individual channel is, perhaps doing some EQ, maybe not, you can tell me. Levels, of course. That must be just tremendously difficult to keep track of.
Well, yeah, the keeping track was done. You're absolutely right. The keeping track, I had a guy that was sitting at my side, where I had taken copious notes in the rehearsal as to what was where, because yes, between songs, many times I had to reverse panning or take echo on or put echo back on, reverb that is, and so this gentleman would read, in those 6 seconds, we had a list, and he went down the list, and I switched very, very quickly. Sometimes even in the first bar or two of music, I was still making small switches, and I had prioritized them that way so that they wouldn't be heard. But that's part of the fun, isn't it?
Well, you're actually a performer along with the musicians, in a sense.
That's what I always thought. That's what I alluded to earlier, is that the console became my instrument. I was a keyboard. Well, I'm a jack of all, master of none, but keyboard was my instrument when the band that got signed, and I started to be an aerospace engineer when I started college before we got signed, and where the math and science aspect of my brain met the creative side is where the whole engineering thing came very easily, and so that's how it has worked.
Mm-hmm. Tom Terrific in the chat room is asking, which Thelma Houston album is it? Do you remember the title?
Well, it's the only one.
Oh,
it's the only one
Sheffield.
on Sheffield. Yeah, on Sheffield Labs. It's called Thelma Houston and Pressure Cooker.
So people should be able to find that. Now, did some of the Sheffield Labs recordings get re-released on CD?
Yes, including Thelma. One of the many problems with going direct to disc is that a lacquer master will only make so many mothers and so many stampers as a result, and hence so many LPs. So when you're done, you're done. You know, you have to either take a second best performance, and I believe Doug did do that. I'm not sure, but we always did a backup on tape, and when it came time for CD, he did use the tape and released Thelma's on CD. Of course, the quality. Of course, the quality is not quite what it was on the LP.
Right.
That's the beginning of an interesting discussion I'm sure we're going to have here. But
which we are going to have, absolutely. Before we do, though, Web4286 in the chat room is asking, do you have any videos of any of these of those sessions?
Sadly, no. None of those were ever filmed. There was so much pressure brought to bear on those sessions that Doug was, you know, especially how video was done back then. Today it would be a little bit better because it's not anywhere near as obtrusive with digital technology and the kind of cameras that, you know, can do low light and so on, and as small as they are. But Doug would never have thought to, and I wouldn't either. I wouldn't have gone for it either. To have a video.
You wouldn't want that distraction.
Right.
How appropriate the title of that album, Pressure Cooker, because it seems like that's what you got, what everyone was under at that time.
Well, that's exactly why I think Doug came up with that name for the band, because of the amount of pressure that everyone was under for performance. And a real quick story, as long as we're on that album, that's kind of cute, is that, of course, we got on the second side of the album on the third day, and we were on a magic take where the band is playing perfect. I'm thrilled with my performance. Everything is going along great. And we got to the last song, which was I've Got to Get You Into My Life, the Beatles song that I had selected for her to record. And I mean, we all knew it in the control room, you know, and the tension just kept building, and ended the first chorus. There's a little interlude, and then started the second verse, and there was no Thelma, nothing. And I panic and look down, and all of a sudden you hear her say, "I'm sorry." She had locked up and forgotten the words, and there went the best take.
Man.
Yeah.
Talk about frustrating.
Yeah, that was frustrating.
Well,
and you got to back way off because you don't, because in order to get the next one, which is the one that we used, you can't make her feel in any way bad about what she had done. It could happen to anybody.
Yeah, sure. Well, those were the days of analog, and when you really had to, just go and do the whole thing. Is it true? Am I correct that now when we're recording digitally primarily, you don't need to cut an entire set of songs? You can do each song individually and just put them together, right?
Right, of course. Now we can just do one. There's nothing. What I've started is sort of the equivalent of that, in that we record one song at a time live. So there's, needless to say, a lot less pressure. And that's both good and bad, because I really, with the right group of musicians and singers, that pressure brings out really good things. In other words, they knew when we were doing 5 songs in a row that if they blew it like Thelma did on the last song, that the whole thing is down the drain and we have to go on to a whole nother take of 5 songs. But just like that's more pressure than one song. Where if you blow it, you're going to go right back and do another take. You sort of plan on doing several takes until you get the one that everyone feels the best about.
Well, that brings us to what you're doing these days. Your experience at Sheffield Labs made it clear, I think, that you enjoy doing these live recordings in the studio and mixing live and going direct to 2-track. Now you can do it digitally, and you're doing it on your own, with your own record label, Bravura. Tell us a little bit about how that got started. Okay,
well, I always Sheffield, for a variety of reasons that aren't important to this, didn't do well long term and went out of business or has gone down. It's a shadow of its former self. Lincoln, actually, I don't think they're doing any new recordings, but Doug Sax is no longer involved with it. Lincoln just runs it on his own. And about 12, 13 years ago, I really got the bug to do something on my own, live to 2-track, where at that time I was figuring I would just go to tape, live to tape, and make for the idea of live performance and everything that brings. And as we said, or the live mixing, I believe, adds to that too. But I started to do that record label. I started to look into that, and things just never came together, and so I put it away. And then a few years ago, looking for a better quality record, since we can't back up. When I'm doing normal records now, we do everything on Pro Tools. 99% of the music that's recorded now is done on a hard disk system called Pro Tools, computer-based. Mm-hmm. And it has, from an audio standpoint, more than its share of problems. And from the beginning, all I've tried to do in my studio here is make it as good as it possibly can be. And one of the many things that needs to be looked at is where to store the mixes when you make them. Do you go right back onto the Pro Tools session at its sampling rate? And I've always chosen to, because I do a kind of a hybrid mixing where it's half analog, half digital. And so I would want to record it on analog tape. But unfortunately, analog tape today has, the two companies that are making tape, the quality control is just not what it once was. And you just can't get tape that I feel confident in. So I was mixing to a SACD recorder, a 1-bit recorder. And
by the way, many of our audience will know what SACD is, Super Audio CD. It was one of 2 formats that was purported as a physical disc to replace or supersede CD with higher resolution audio. The other was DVD. The other was DVD audio. And that used normal PCM sampling, which is what you have on a CD, but with higher sampling rates and greater bit depths to make a higher quality audio. SACD used an entirely different system of digitization called DSD, Digital Stream Direct, I believe it is, which is a 1-bit system operating at a very high rate and giving you a very, very high quality output. Or
Correct.
Recording. Now, let me ask you this. Why did you end up preferring SACD over DVD audio?
I can't say. Well, the answer to that question is that DVD audio used 96K. And
96 kilohertz sampling rate.
Right. And whereas at 24-bit, the regular CD being 16-bit 44.1, and whereas that certainly is an improvement, it wasn't as big an improvement as I would have liked, or as Doug Sax would have liked. So back in those days, I did more. There was a lot of surround mixing done in those 2 formats, and I did mixed for both of them, whatever the client wanted, which would be the record company, whatever they had decided to go with. But for my mixing here, 2-channel of regular records, the best that I had found until a few years ago was this DSD recorder with an Ed Meitner converter. And Doug always said, why don't you go back to PCM but try it at 192? And I said that I hadn't heard a converter. I hadn't gone in looking for a 192 converter, but I knew the one in Pro Tools didn't sound as good, was more electronic sounding than the same converter when you put it down to 96K. And so I mentioned it to a design engineer that has worked for Doug and has done some very esoteric things for myself as well, named Josh Florian, JCF Audio. And he came back with an idea that he wanted to try and for a 192 converter, specifically built for 192 with a different topology than most people are using, that had been kind of discounted. And I told him to go ahead, and he tried it, and the results were spectacular to Doug and I. And so when we first heard it, Doug said that there should be a format with 24 192 for the hi-fi community that you could master albums into, so that they could get true fidelity, and especially not put the digital limiting that everybody in the CD world has been forced to use, because the artists and record companies want everything to be as loud as everybody else. So the technology that makes everything as loud as everyone else does not sound that good. We've had this problem ever since 45s, really. And in the LP, everyone wanted as loud an LP as you could get, but being the physical medium with the constraints that it has, you could only do so much without seriously altering the sound of the music, taking all the bass off, for instance, because bass took up the most space on real estate on an LP. So I suggested for this medium, Blu-ray discs, since it's already, people are buying them and already have them for high definition video, then it will hold on the white paper for the Blu-ray discs is completely fine with 24-192. Interestingly enough, Sony, who developed DSD and developed the Blu-ray disc, does not make any consideration on the white paper for their own format. So they basically have, it shows that they completely have abandoned it.
The SACD, the DSD, yeah.
Yeah, and like I said, I thought that it was better than the 96K version, but this 192 with Josh's converter, at least, this is really something spectacular. And I had done some mixes on both, to both versions, the SACD or DSD and the PCM at 192. And Doug and I blindfold picked between the two, and we picked the 192 every time. It was a horse race. I don't want to say that it pushed DSD into the background at all, but it definitely was the winner. And so this idea is where we started, of trying to get something going for the hi-fi community. That was all it was. Mm-hmm. And among the people from Pioneer came to the mastering lab to hear what I had been doing, and they loved the idea and asked how they could help. And I said, I don't know, you tell us. And they said, well, why don't you come to the CES show and give a talk about what you want to do, and we'll put out a bulletin, a press release, and advertise it. And so that's what took place 4 years ago. And the people, Doug was supposed to come and do the talks every day, but he bailed on me at the last minute, so I had to do it. And all the people, I had done several tests with just friends in the studio to direct a 2-track, just to show this medium how good it can sound. And we also mastered several good sounding things from other engineers that were normal records that had been recorded, mostly, I'm sure, at 96K on Pro Tools. But he mastered those into the 24-192 without the extra level, without the extra compression and all that, with full dynamic range, and now, full fidelity, to show, what normal albums would sound like. And this is what I played at the CES show. And after every show that I did, the people would come up and try to buy the recordings that I had done with my friends that were just tests. And I said, well, I'm not a record company. And they said, well, it's just a file. Couldn't you sell it to me? And I said, well, I suppose I could, but I'm not a record company. And about 6 months later, I started thinking, maybe I should be a record company. So that's where it got started.
Right. Beatmaster in the chat room asked the question, what should the sampling rate and bit rate be that we should all aim for as producer and consumers? I would guess your answer would be 192.24.
As far as I'm concerned, I just don't understand why, when we have this technology and it's been sitting there for some time, why we don't use it. There's absolutely no reason not to use it. We've worked so hard over the years since Wax to improve the state of recorded and reproduced musical art. We reached as high as we got with analog. And analog, I mean, I am not Mr. Analog. I was Mr. Analog over early digital, but analog is fraught with problems that we just had to work around. Unfortunately for me, when we went to early digital, 44.1 digital, both in the recording studio and as a release medium on the CD, there's just so many artifacts and things that I don't like about it that analog, to me became, analog tape and LPs became the de facto winner for myself.
Well, this brings up the question that Oh, I'm sorry. You had to finish. You wanted to finish that thought. I apologize.
Well, no, that's basically it, I guess. I mean, so sure, I would like to see, as high a sampling rate, bit rate as possible. And with the way things are going now, and the future of perhaps all media is the cloud, one way or another, and speeds of everything will be getting faster as they are, and so on. There's less and less reason not to be doing it.
Somebody in the chat room, I don't remember who, I don't see it right now, asked, when did you first work on this 192 converter that you ended up really liking? What year was that?
I think it would probably, here's one that I can't answer. I think it was about 4.5 years ago that it started, as I remember.
Well, this whole discussion brings up the question to me of 44.1 kilohertz sampling rate and 16-bit bit depth was chosen because human hearing only goes up to 20 kilohertz, and if you record at 44.1, you can reproduce frequencies at as much as half of whatever the sampling rate is. So 44.1 will give you theoretically 22.05 kilohertz. So let's call it 20 kilohertz, which is the absolute extreme top end of human hearing. So it seems to me, at least theoretically, that if you go for a higher sampling rate, like 96 kilohertz or 192 kilohertz, you shouldn't be able to hear any difference. And yet, according to you, you clearly do. Why do you suppose that is?
Do I answer a question with a question? You came to my studio. You came to my studio a while back, and I played you some. Did you hear a difference?
I absolutely did.
Yes.
My question remains, though. Why do you suppose?
Yes.
What is it about? And I've heard it plenty of other places as well. 96 kilohertz sounds better than 44, and 192 sounds better than 96. The question is why? What effects are we perceiving? If it's not the actual frequencies up in those high ranges, which it's not, clearly.
Now, I've talked to several people about this. Yes, on a theoretical level, and I'll be the first to agree, the Nyquist frequency is above human hearing. Why doesn't it sound good? I don't know what to tell you, except that I learned from Doug Sachs early on in my career in the early 70s that numbers don't mean very much. There are things that we have not, that as good as test equipment is, and I'm not saying, and test procedures are, I'm not saying that that you should throw that out. Having said that, more than once have I heard in A/B tests, and Doug continues to do and taught me how to do very scientific A/B tests where you need a great deal of resolution, because if you don't have the resolution, an A/B test doesn't mean much. But if you have a really good amount of resolution and a really scientific A/B test, it's amazing what you can hear. You can hear an amplifier, for instance, that'll have 10 times the distortion, still very, very low, but 10 times, and it'll sound better than the amplifier with 1/10 of distortion. And we've seen that over and over and over again. So the first answer is, I don't know, but I know that there's things that measurements don't cover. The second answer is that people learned a long time ago, in the construction of hardware, that to go for the sky. I mean, nobody tries to build a speaker that only goes to 20K. Nobody builds an amplifier that only goes to 20K.
True enough.
So what goes on out of the range of hearing definitely seems to affect what it goes on in the range of hearing. And with the CD, by the way, that's a technical discussion that I've had done to me, but I'm not smart enough in that area to be able to repeat it. But what's left, what goes on after the filtering is done, because they do have to have filters to make sure that none of that nasty stuff above 20K gets into the file, that what's left with where that information goes adds to, or is one of the big contributing factors to what I've always heard as a very unnatural and relatively harsh high end on a CD compared to, for instance, an LP or a 96, let alone a 192 file.
Mm-hmm. Certainly, I've always surmised a couple things. One is the filter that you mentioned that you have to put in front of the input signal so that you don't get anything above 20K coming into the recording. But that is pretty much of a brick wall filter, which introduces all kind of phase anomalies. The other issue that I think we can address here is that even though 96 and 192 will record those higher harmonics, those higher frequencies, higher than we can hear, those frequencies may very well interact in such a way to produce byproducts that are in the audible range.
Right, and that was what I was saying about earlier. That's exactly right, and we see it. Certain things like claves, for instance, they have information at 100K. That was one of the stranger ones to me. But a lot of oddball instruments, I mean, not oddball instruments, but things that didn't make, like French horn, they have information at 50K. That's a very low sounding instrument, but it has information way, way, way up there. The piano, the overtone series in the piano, that was always one of the toughest instruments on analog tape. Analog tape really does not like acoustic piano whatsoever. And that's one of the things to me that's been so impressive about 192, where I don't have any of the artifacts that I don't care for in lower quality digital. Then in 192, I'm able to get an absolute mirror image of what I'm hearing with all the instruments, but some of them are more impressive than others, like the acoustic piano, where I hear what's coming through the glass, and then I hear the output of the digital A to D, D to A, and for the first time in 33 years in this studio, well, 33 now, I heard it 4 years ago, I cannot hear the difference. That never happened with analog tape. Analog tape, the musicians would play, I'm listening in analog through the board, they come in, I rewind the tape. Do I hear what I just heard? No, not quite. The top end is not quite the same. There's some compression going on. If you record at 30 IPS, the higher speed the professionals used, the top end is more transparent and less noise, but the bottom end, the bass and bass drum, aren't as tight and focused as they were before. If you record at the lower speed, 15 IPS, the low end is good now, but the top end is not as extended and not as open and transparent. So this 192 just seemed to give me absolutely everything.
Yeah. It also answers another question that I've long had, which is, at what point does digital recording become indistinguishable from analog? And in your case, anyway, it's 192/24.
Yes. And in my studio, where we built everything from the console, which is, single-ended, to a lot of very, very high quality tube stuff, tube preamps, tube stereo bus, summing bus. It's the most high resolution studio I've ever been in. And with that amount of resolution, I cannot hear the difference between live musicians playing and the 192. People have asked me, if you went ahead and doubled that, what do you think? And I said, it'd be silly not to, but at least as far as what we have for reproduction facilities, speakers, and so on at this point in time, if I can hear the difference here, I'm not sure I'll hear the difference there. 96K, I can absolutely hear and hear. An analog to a 96K, I can absolutely hear with the degree of resolution I have.
Mm-hmm. Well, you've mentioned your studio, and I want to get into that. I want to show people what your studio is looking like these days, and also take a look at some of the advantages of 192 from a numbers game or a measurement game. So hold on for just a second, though, because I do want to take a moment to thank our sponsor for this episode, which is Hulu Plus. Now, Hulu Plus offers unlimited streaming of current hit TV shows as well as many classic series as well. And if for one low monthly rate, you can stream as much as you want, including, as I said, those current TV shows. So as soon as the new episode comes out, you can get it on Hulu Plus and watch it on your schedule rather than on the network schedule. It's a super fast and easy way to get all your favorite shows. And it's connected to your you can get it on your TV by connecting just about any consumer electronics device today, including the TV itself, which probably has a Hulu Plus app, Blu-ray players, gaming consoles, dedicated streaming boxes, smartphones, tablets, just about everything these days has a Hulu Plus app that you can use to watch any and all of the many, many TV offerings they have available, as well as movies. They do have some movies, but they do concentrate more on television shows. And you can even start on one device and finish on another, making it the ultimate inconvenience, really. Now, of course, they've got tons of current shows like The Colbert Report and The Daily Show, which I always love to watch, and very timely, so you want to see those right away. But also some great classic shows as well. Law and Order, I still watch those. Firefly, who doesn't love Firefly amongst those of us who are geeks? Twilight Zone, man, I love watching that on Hulu Plus. Now, Hulu Plus is offering something special for our viewers and listeners. You can get an extra free week by going to huluplus.com/twit, which extends their normal 1-week free trial to 2 full weeks. Or you can go to twit.tv and click on the Hulu Plus banner. Either way, we do want you to either do that or go to the URL, huluplus.com/twit, so that we know how many people are taking advantage of this wonderful offer. We thank Hulu Plus very much for their support of Home Theater Geeks and the entire Twit network. And we do hope that you enjoy watching Hulu Plus. Okay, so we've been talking about recording digital audio at a very high sampling rate and bit depth, which has now finally, at 192 kilohertz and 24 bits, achieved a plateau wherein a pair of golden ears, such as those owned by my guest Bill Schnee, cannot tell the difference between that and analog. And we want to we've got a nice graphic to show you about what this difference really means objectively. We've been talking somewhat subjectively here, but we do have some objective things to show you as well. It's called Bravura Advantages. And this graphic will come up here. Here it is. Bill, why don't you tell us what we're looking at here while John zooms in to the different parts. Bill, are you with us?
This is just...
here we are.
Hello?
Yeah, you're here.
I'm there? Okay. Yeah, they cut my mic off. I was trying to talk during the Hulu Plus at the end of it to tell you that I am a Hulu Plus subscriber, and it's a wonderful thing. My daughter actually convinced me to get it for her, and it's incredibly convenient when you miss certain shows or bits and whatnot.
Oh, great.
Back
cool.
to the graphic is something that my visual guy dreamed up on his own as to what along the lines of where we're going to go with it, and it shows basically shows there the full dynamic of a 192 compared to the digital stuff, the way we do things, the overly compressed CD, let alone the MP3. And
so, and let's just make sure everybody understands what we're looking at. Those of you who are only listening, try to catch this on video if you can, because this is really very interesting graphic information here. At the bottom, we have an MP3, typical MP3, which is very compressed. And what that means is that the dynamic range, the difference between the softest and the loudest parts, is very small. And almost everything is as loud as it can possibly be.
And let me say this about that. The one that my guy used, I have to tell you, I don't know where he got that, but that is a very unusual MP3. Everything I ever see is a complete bar. There's no dynamics anymore on any pop record. It's just a solid bar. And the CDs, the CD that he has in the next cell above it that you see there, the typical one looks more like what's on the bottom, where you have some dynamics but not much. But the point is still the same. What we've done with starting with the CD, and then of course the MP3 is made from the CD master, is compress things to a point that the dynamics are virtually eliminated. We have a 96 dB medium. Everyone's complained about this for years. A medium with 96 dB of dynamic range, and we're using 5% of it. And that's just so that everything will come up at the same volume. You don't have to use that thing called a volume control. And I understand it to a degree on iPod players, that type of thing, even though they have a normalizer that kind of does that, an onboard compressor that'll do that, but not to the same extent. But
am I correct that this originally came out of the radio days, that people wanted very highly compressed songs to play on the radio so that people could hear the entire song over car road noise and so on?
And also an AM radio where the loudness, the signal was a factor. So, you could still be held up a little, have a little. And I always make I think that it started, I don't know if this is true or not, but it makes sense. Back in the days, starting in let's say in the early 60s, when disc jockeys programmed their show, there was no program director that told them what to play. They could play whatever they wanted. And I remember growing up, the guy from 6 to 9, he had a certain style. He would play anything he wanted. And sometimes it might be a pop record. Sometimes it might even be a standard country record or whatever. He just played good music, that kind of thing. And the guy from 9 to 12, he had his own taste and whatnot. Well, the program directors would go into the radio stations and with the new 45 and say, this is the new single. What do you think? And he's in the disc jockey puts, on one turntable, sends out the next record, turns to him and says, well, let's hear what you got, and puts it on the other turntable and plays it only in the control room for him to hear. And as my hypothetical goes, that the promotion man goes back to the record company and says, you got to make the single hotter, because it was up next to this thing he was playing and it was, much softer. So it's got to be hotter. Loudness has always been equated with better and louder. And you have an A/B test that I was mentioning earlier. One of the things when I was talking about what Doug taught me was a 1 dB difference in an A/B test can totally invalidate the test. If you don't have the same level, you're going to go with what's louder. That will appeal to to your psyche. That level thing will appeal.
Boy, that sounds exactly like what happens with TVs. When you go shopping for a TV, the reason they're all too bright and too blue is because that's what naturally draws the eye on the showroom floor.
Yeah, exactly.
Same sort of deal. Okay.
Same deal.
So dynamic range then gets compressed typically. And what you're doing, if we can go back to that graphic for a second and look at the top bar, you are not applying dynamic compression and you're recording at a much higher sampling rate, which gives you a much great, and at 24 bits gives you a theoretical dynamic range of what? I forget what it is. Somebody in the chat room will tell me.
I'm sure. Yes, the point is it gives you the full dynamic range. In other words, exactly the way the musicians played it. And on lots of the early recordings that I did, I purposely stayed away from any analog limiting, or very little. Only when I really, really wanted it or felt I needed it, analog limiting on the recording itself, which we do for creative reasons, to level out a bass, for instance, or sometimes a singer that's too dynamic or whatever. And limiters by and large were developed years ago to keep the needles out of the red, and we ended up using them, however, for their deleterious effects. Nobody could make a limiter, analog or, tube or solid state, that would do it without having some kind of a sound. Well, we ended up using the limiter because we liked that sound and we could affect things with it. But on the early recordings, and since I have so much headroom everywhere, I let a lot of things go so that the peak factor is really there, that honest peak factor is really there. In fact, on the website, on my website, there's some Christmas songs that you can download. Now, they're only and I say only, they're on CD quality, but they're very, very good CD sounding recordings. They came from the 190.
Yes, that's what I was about to say. They come from the 192 original recordings.
Yes,
and you've downsampled them to 44. But doing so, I think, gives you a better result than if you record at 44 to begin with.
Oh, beyond a shadow of a doubt. Much, much better. Much better.
Now, the other advantage that I wanted to point out was also on the bottom part of that graphic, which has to do with frequency response, I believe. But let's take a look at that graphic here. Here it is.
Yes.
Oh, it's
that shows on the far right is the MP3, where there's nothing but noise above 16K. And then the CD the master that in essence that it came from, where you see the Nyquist frequency that you referred to earlier, where nothing is above it. And then on the left is one from one of my recordings where you see that instead of stopping at 20, it goes up into 35,000.
Right.
And again, as you pointed out, that, you know, what does all that mean if you can't hear? And I think we covered that. But there's definitely an aspect of all this that needs to be heard to be believed, you know.
Exactly. That's exactly right. By the way, I did get the note in the chat room here that 24 bits gives you, I believe, here it is, Cargoplex. 24-bit digital audio calculates to 144 dB dynamic range. Which is more than what humans can hear. I mean, 0 is absolutely silent, and 130, I think, is the threshold of pain. That's like a jet engine at 2 feet away or something ridiculous. So, you know, you're not going to hear we can't hear a dynamic range of 144 decibels. So that's just by way of completing that thought. Okay, now in the last part of the show here, I do want to just point out a couple things. Oh, one is the other graphic that we have with the name Bravura, and that gives us. Let's see if we can hear it. Is the packaging? You said you were developing CDs. I'm sorry, Blu-rays to hold this 192/24, which Blu-ray players can reproduce and modern home theaters can reproduce. And I just wanted to show people your idea for the packaging, because I think this is very cool.
Yeah, another part when I decided to start this record company, the first thing, of course, that bothers me is that kids have never heard anything better. The average 16-year-old has never even heard a CD. They've only lived on earbuds and a docking station, or at the most computer speakers for their music listening. And and obviously since the mid '80s, when CDs took over, the CD has dominated. But one of the other things that we lost when we went away from the LP was the ability to read the lyrics. They still put them in the CD package, but who can read them? And
not
then
me, that's for sure.
Yeah, and the MP3. All they get is a little picture of the artist. I mean, there's nothing to tie them to the artist. So another thing that's been gravely missing for me, for young people, is the idea of the, quote, album experience, because they buy songs now. They don't buy albums anymore. And I'm hoping that people would go back, now, yes, there's plenty to blame the record companies for not making good enough albums, or making albums where they tried for singles so hard that the albums had no depth. I mean, you go back, like you said, to Steely Dan in the 70s. That's the era of making albums where, some of my favorite songs on a lot of albums, including Asia or Gaucho, are the ones that were never singles. And that was the way it would be back in the album era. And it can still be that way. It just, the whole depth of, by focusing on singles, the record companies sort of limited the depth of the artist in a lot of ways by forcing him by making the single the almighty, and we have to have that. And whereas it was true that the single was the best promotion tool that they had and was very important, it's a shame that it was at the expense of an album with some depth. But so I thought that the great thing would be to make the album experience come back. So my packaging on that graphic that you showed shows that I'm planning on using a double LP jacket, full-size LP jacket. In one panel will be the album notes, the geek notes, the lyrics, anything that you want. And then the other one will be the molded plastic, lightly molded plastic that will hold one CD, if it's the CD version, or the more expensive audiophile version that'll have a Blu-ray disc, a CD for the car, and then either a DVD with digits or a thumb drive with digits, whatever, for the computer audio files.
Right.
But there you'll be able to, and I'll have on the shrink wrap, I'll have a sticker that says, we're trying to bring back the album experience where you partner with the artist, you get into them. They've spent a lot of time and energy making this album for you. And so why don't you, at least the first time that you hear this music, please, with no distractions, just sit down, listen to the music, and look through, read whatever you want, look at the pictures and all that, and try to, become one with the emotional content that they're offering you.
which is really one of the primary things that you're trying to do here, is to deliver an emotional experience, which I'm sure you will agree, and I've heard many other people say, when you do this super high quality recording, digital recording at 192, 24 bits and so on, you're actually able to convey much more of the emotional content of the music than you are even from CD or especially from MP3.
Exactly. Exactly. Both from a frequency standpoint and a compression standpoint and all of it. It's been so interesting when I've done the recordings that I've done, when I have musicians that have never done this, it's amazing to watch them when they come in the control room, either musicians that have recorded here over the years or musicians that have never been here. Invariably on one of these 192 sessions, they'll come in for the playback and you'll see them, or they'll comment. You'll see it in their face, or they'll comment. They know something's different, even if they don't know from a hi-fi standpoint, an audiophile standpoint, what the difference is. But they're feeling something that they're not used to feeling when they come into the control room for a playback.
Mm-hmm. Let's take a quick look at your studio before we finish up here. I know we've got some pictures. We got one of the control room, and I just want to make sure everybody gets a chance to see this. I've been in this control room. It's as you said, it's a completely custom-built mixer.
Yep. Almost everything in the studio is been highly customized. Like I said, I learned from Doug Sachs, and his brother built all the electronics for the mastering lab when he started in the late '60s, and we just knew that we could, build a better mousetrap when we did this 34 years ago.
I'm happy to see you've got. I'm happy to see you've got tannoys there as some of your on desk monitors, which I have behind me too. People can see. In fact, it brings up a question that was in the chat room: was headphones and speaker brands, which do you find to be the most satisfying? Lawn Dog in the chat room says, obviously, Bill is a very critical listener, which is true.
Yeah. Headphones I can't speak to. I haven't gotten into headphones since I was into hi-fi many years ago. We use workhorse headphones in the studio because they're misused. They're not there for their fidelity. So I can't begin to speak to that. Speakers is very, very subjective. I use, as you pointed out, highly modified tannoys. They have different boxes, different crossovers and they're not the most hi-fi speaker let's just say from a transparency standpoint. There's a lot better speakers that are much more transparent. They just are a good workhorse for me. And I find when I work on speakers that are better quality, that my mixes don't come out better. So I have to work a little harder on the tannoys, but then when I play it on better speakers, I'm much happier with the results than when the tables are turned.
Mm-hmm. Let's take a look inside the recording studio itself, which is actually quite beautiful.
Pretty part.
The pretty part, yes. This is where the musicians would actually sit and play. And you've got some playback in there too, some custom speakers, I think, up on the walls, right?
Well, those are just Altec 604s, again modified. Those were modified back in the 70s for all the studios that used them by Doug Sachs. They also have different crossovers and an extra woofer, an extended woofer to get more low bass. But they're basically just Altec 604s, which is funny because that was the workhorse of the recording world in the 60s into the 70s. And the tannoys are a concentric speaker, very, very similar, not only concept, but similar sounding. And I think that's part of the reason why I landed on the tannoys. And they've been with me ever since.
How long have you been in this studio?
This July will be 32 years.
Quite incredible. And it was pretty much designed by you, and you told me the designer that you worked with. I've forgotten his name.
Well, the acoustical design was definitely Seat of the Pants and Prayer, and and that is absolutely true. And the aesthetic design was a draftsman, actually, a Swedish draftsman in the architect's office, who came up with the way it looked. I had told the architect when we started, I don't care what it looks like, I only care what it sounds like, and if we don't get it the first time, we'll tear it out and do it again. And fortunately, by the Seat of the Pants and Prayer method, we got it. We nailed the sound right away, and then and I'm very grateful to the draftsman, the creative Swedish draftsman that made it look the way it looks.
Dr. T in the chat room says, I don't see any right angles anywhere. And I didn't either when I was in there. We can take another look at number 2 or the side or the back, or there's another view.
That's the front. That's basically the same angle that the last picture was taken, just looking at the front instead of the back side. That little rack there is one of the racks of tube preamps that we have. We have a solid state preamp on the console, and those roll around racks have tube preamps in them. And yeah, there's no right angles anywhere. And we went with the there's another picture from
another view.
Yeah, that's an isolation room on the right. The glass that you see on the right or above that piano that's one of the isolation rooms. There's another one that's to the left, and there's an alcove in the middle, and that's where the camera was for this picture.
Mm-hmm.
And that you can see in that picture, up in the top left there, there's that's a skylight. The room is naturally lit. That's the natural. These pictures were taken with the natural light. I spent so many years when I built the studio in dark, dank boxes, dead acoustical and dark and ugly, that in addition to wanting a room with a sound, which is what the main reason I built the studio was to get a room that had a sound. And you heard when you walked into it, you hear a voice in it, and you know right away that it's giving you something, that it's not dead, super dead. And the other thing I wanted was to get out of that dark, dank thing. So we have skylights in the room. The interesting thing about that is one of the first sessions in the studio was Supertramp doing their very last album, sadly. And I had gone on the road to record an album. And when I got back, they had blanketed up all the windows and put colored lights in. They turned it right. They turned my studio right back into what I had, been running from. So it was
right. But it was what they were comfortable in.
That's what they wanted.
Still in all, when you're doing what you're doing, which is recording live performances, direct to 2-track, but I mean, you've got the whole band in there. They're playing together. It's like a performance. You want a room that sounds comfortable, that you can listen comfortably in. And some recording studios, it's difficult to do because they're so dead.
Right. That was the reason that I wanted to build a studio. The first studio that I worked in, unbeknownst to me, was a very small rock kind of studio, but it had a sound, and I didn't know that or realize the importance of that until I left that studio and started working around town in the various other studios. And I finally realized part of what I was fighting is the acoustics in the room, because when they built dead rooms so that the sound of instrument A will not get in instrument B's microphone, unfortunately that dead room allows instrument A to not sound as good as it can. So there's a trade-off that you have to have there. So we have isolation rooms, 4 different areas that are completely isolated if somebody needs to be isolated. Otherwise, when you put things in the room, you have leakage. You have the sound of instrument A and instrument B, but that sound is a good sound. It doesn't hurt you. It in fact can help you.
Right. We got a question earlier in the chat room, and I'm not going to scroll back up and find it, but they were curious about microphones and what microphones you were using. And I know that you said you have some custom, like everything else in your studio, some custom built mics, even with 5-pin connectors. What's going on with those?
Yeah, the connector thing is a long explanation that doesn't mean anything. But Toby Foster is the guy that I say he taught me everything I know, because he was the first guy that heard my early recordings that I thought were dreck, and he said, you really are good at this, and he encouraged me. And so then when I went back to college after the band failed, I'd drive into the studio that he worked at every night and ask a million questions. At least it seemed to him like a million, until he couldn't take it anymore and would send me away. He came up with a central powering scheme, because we have the answer to the question is, I have a huge collection of tube microphones, all what I consider to be the great Neumann and AKG microphones of old, 50 years or more old, and some other brands too back then, but primarily, a great percentage of those. And I also have the Sheffield mics, the mics that later in Sheffield's life that Doug Sachs and the design team came up with, that are line level mics, where there's no transformer in the microphone and there's no need for a transformer in the preamp, because they come out at line level. And those we didn't have those on Thelma. They hadn't been invented yet. But in the later recordings, we had those microphones, and they're the most colorless microphone I've ever heard by far.
Mm. Well, we've come to the, I'm sorry, you got one more thing to say?
No, go ahead. No.
I was going to say we've come to the end of a fabulous hour, and I've got much more to talk about, so maybe you'll come back sometime, will you?
Oh, I'd love that.
Great. Now, let's make sure everybody knows that they can find out more about this project that you're working on at bravurarecords.com. You don't have any product for sale yet, right?
Right. Let's cover that real quick.
Let's cover that quick, shall we?
Because I get that a lot since I've been going for 3 years now. With website's been going for, I guess it is 2.5 years, whatever, 3 years. When can I buy? When can I buy? People download the Christmas songs and see the artist, whatever. When can I buy? If I had that answer, I'd give it to you. Part of my problem is, I guess, and don't tell my wife, I'm admitting it, but I'm stubborn. And
somehow I think she already knows.
I mean, she doesn't hear me admitting it, though.
Okay.
And I really want to, I don't want to do just like a little tabletop records kind of thing. I have, as I told you when you were here at great length, I have big part of the motivation for me for this is to try to get Fidelity back into the world as being important for young people's sake. Like I mentioned earlier, young people have never even heard a CD. And so that's very, very important to me. So instead of doing just a tabletop records for the hi-fi community, I really want this to be I want to come out with a big bang, like 10 albums on all different genres. I think I have 8 of them in one form or another ready for completion. I still don't have the funding to do it on a worldwide basis the way I want to. So if any of your listeners have any ideas on that,
please contact Bill Schnee at bravurarecords.com. Well, I do hope you find the answer to the funding problem, which is always a tough problem, especially these days. But I do want to see this project succeed, because getting high-quality audio recordings, music recordings that convey more of the emotional content of the music into more hands is a very worthwhile goal, and I wish you all the best luck and success with that.
Thank you. And on that note, I do too, and it's like the little engine that could is the way I look at this. And I knew when I started it that it was completely impossible task. So it's going to take a miracle to pull it off. But if I can get the ball rolling, there's definitely other things that are out there that are trying to do this. But I'm concentrating. I'm concentrating on. I mean, I got very good jazz recordings already, but I have 2 young artists, and I think, youth is where it'll be. They won't understand it all. It'll be starting on MP3. I know it and all that, but if they know, they'll hear the live aspect, and they'll know about something about this new technology, and, and kids are a lot hipper, obviously, with technology than they ever were. They grow up with it. If I can get the ball rolling a little bit harder than it's been, then I guarantee you all the record companies will jump on board. They'll go, who's doing our high fidelity recording, or why aren't we releasing things in higher resolution?
Right.
And and it can come to pass.
Well, I sure hope it does. And I thank you again for being here, and look forward to having you back.
All right. Thanks so much, Scott.
So again, Bill's website is bravurarecords.com. I do encourage you to go there, check it out, check out the samples that he has there. And hopefully soon we will see some of those products for sale. You can find me, of course, at avsforum.com and on hometheaterhifi.com. You can email me at scott@twit.tv, and you can follow me on Twitter at htgeekscott. Next week, my guest geek is scheduled to be Joe Kane, the video guru who has been on the show a couple times, who's got some pretty strong opinions about 4K. And so I'm looking forward very much to hearing what those opinions are, and his take on the whole 4K Ultra HD phenomenon that is engulfing the home theater industry as we speak. So I do hope you will join me then. Until then, geek out.